Welcome to the Heart of CIRS podcast. I'm your hostess, Melanie Joy Pensack, here to share heartfelt conversations with folks recovering from CIRS and with those special people serving the CIRS community. The podcast was created to help bring awareness to the physical, emotional, and mental experiences of folks navigating CIRS day to day. The world needs to know what CIRS folks go through for deeper empathy and understanding. Through stories and vulnerability, we can help the world understand the winding journey of CIRS recovery. Thank you for being here to open your mind and to open your heart. Hello, everybody. I am very excited that we have Louise Carder here on the Heart of CIRS podcast. Louise Carder is a powerhouse. I admire her ambition and her ability to spread the word about CIRS in the UK and globally, taking on UK and Europe. And I am happy that she's here today to talk with us a little bit more about the GENIE test. So genomic expression, inflammation explained. This test is based on the work of Dr. James Ryan and Dr. Richie Shoemaker. We can actually see the genetic expression of what is happening when we are in biotoxin exposure and the effects of those exposures. I interviewed Dr. Ryan in season 2. If you want to learn more about the background of the test and how it came to be and what actually happens with your blood work, please go back and listen to that episode in season 2. Basically, it's a gene expression transcriptomic assay. There's 188 genes. It helps you to know what is showing up as your biotoxin of choice, what's going on genetically in your body at that moment. A little bit more about Louise. I want you to know about her wonderful background. Louise has a BSc in nutritional medicine. Her clinical practice is based on her professional status as a registered nutrition practitioner. She is a member of the Naturopathic Nutrition Association and registered with the Complementary and Natural Healthcare Council, representing the highest level of professional accreditation available in the UK at this time for nutritional therapists. Louise is also qualified to undertake blood draws and is a member of the National Association of Phlebotomists. She is committed to postgraduate study and regularly exceeds annual continued professional development targets set by NNA and CNHC. In 2018, Louise became the first European practitioner certified in the Shoemaker protocol for CIRS and is still the only nutrition professional to be certified. Louise became a certified Bredesen practitioner in 2016, and she's also certified as a nutritional genomics counselor when she was a member of BANT, where she was a director, committee, and inaugural head of communications. BANT, along with the NNA, represent the gold standard for nutritional therapists. Wow, Louise, thank you for being here today to help us unpack the GENIE test a little bit more.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Louise and I share, I believe, this love of this test. I've heard Louise talk about it, and I know that she does a lot of investigation to understand the genes and what is showing up for everybody. So I'm thrilled that she's taking some time to really unpack for us more about that test. But before we go into it, would you be open to sharing a little bit about your own relationship to CIRS and your journey?
Yes, of course. I think as a practitioner, it can be enormously interesting for your clients to know when you've also been influenced by the very things that they're coming to see you about. And although I didn't know it at the time, yes, my childhood is very much defined by living in a series of water damaged buildings. My parents liked to renovate property and then we would move on to another one. I went to 9 different schools as a result of this. And distinctly remember one house when I was aged about 9 that they were renovating and the whole roof had to get redone. So we would basically sit there with buckets and just watch the water come down into the buckets. So Who knew that that would define the rest of my professional life at that age in a positive way? But of course, I had to go through the difficult times as a result of the chronic inflammatory response that I experienced as a child. I always knew that something wasn't quite right. My brain didn't seem to quite engage in the right way. I couldn't focus and concentrate. I had a myriad of symptoms, from digestive symptoms to appetite issues, kept getting static shocks, and a whole host of other complicating symptoms for many, many years, which led to me underperforming at school and not setting out in the career path I would have liked to first time around. It wasn't until I left home that I suddenly started to realize that the symptoms that I had experienced when I was younger were starting to melt away. And my brain started to work when I realized that I had a problem with gluten, and I was diagnosed with dermatitis herpetiformis, which is essentially the skin form of celiac disease. So I would say that really was the first thing that set my life on a different trajectory, because part of my brain woke up at that point. I realized that I did actually have a bit of a brain and I could put it to some use. So life started to change in a more positive way because of that. But having left home and being away at university, I was in a very different kind of accommodation setup, and I suddenly started to feel a lot better. So I'd always wondered what was different about my life when I was growing up to my new life as an adult. It was probably in about 2010 that I just happened upon Dr. Shoemaker's book, Surviving Mold. And all of a sudden, a light bulb went off for me. This was around the time that I had just graduated from my degree in nutritional medicine. And it was quite an interesting time, because as you do when you're in a healthcare related degree or course, you start to talk to your course mates about your own health. And I realized that I was a little bit more complicated than everybody else. I still wasn't getting the answers. And so I'd kept searching, and that had led me by chance to Dr. Shoemaker's book. And I just became completely interested in what he was doing. So I found the website and really thought that I wanted to try and somehow get my tests done and find out more about CIRS, but it just wasn't to be at that time. Being in the UK, trying to get samples to the States, etc., it was just too difficult. So I went down the functional route and did a lot more postgraduate training in functional medicine, which then led me to doing Dale Bredeson's training in cognitive decline and Alzheimer's. So I actually went to California to do Dale's second only training course there, actually. And while I was there, he started to talk about type 3 CIRS and referenced Dr. Shoemaker. And so before I left California, I had contacted Dr. Shoemaker and started my journey to certification in CIRS. So that's my journey, really.
Wow. I had no idea how it came together working with Dr. Shoemaker and the surviving mold community.
And while I was over in the States, I realized how I could get the test done. And so when I came back to the UK, I set up a separate company so that I could actually get the tests done myself and also facilitate other people to get the test done. So that's my second role in life now, is to run a lab facilitation service from the UK and Europe that now works with people globally and their practitioners to be able to get their lab testing shipped to the States so that they can actually get the answers that they need from anywhere in the world. So just doing that for myself has morphed into a completely different career than I could ever have imagined. It's such a joy to be able to do that. So having had confirmation of my own CIRS situation, I was very definitely hooked onto CIRS, and it being a big answer for me. I thought that we understood the landscape, as you probably did. I think we all thought, yeah, we've got this now, we know. And then all of a sudden, GENIE came along. And it was opening the door to this amazing, amazing test. But then you open the door and it blows your mind and you want to close the door again and go, oh, that's really big. This is a lot to learn, isn't it? I thought I'd just go about to slowly learn it and just take up any education that I could on it. And I've just come to absolutely love this test, as you have too.
I'm so glad that you brought up the lab and that you started to create the opportunity for people to get their blood labs drawn in the UK and Europe and around the world. That is a huge, huge step forward for this work. Anybody that's abroad that gets this lab work done, please thank Louise for that, because really for many years, there was no way to be able to do that. So you're in a wonderful position because of the work that you've created. So thank you for committing to that.
Well, and I have to pass that thank you on to the team in the office who deal with the logistics around the world every day with the dry ice, with the blood draws from anywhere in the world who make this happen, because they're an incredible team.
So yes, we both love this test. What do you find to be the most compelling piece of it, and how is that coming together with your clients?
Oh my gosh, I can't say how much I love this test. And anytime I speak to Dr. Ryan or Dr. Shoemaker, I am saying thank you for it, really. It just gives so much more information. So the biomarkers are great, the environmental results are great, but this test really helps connect the dots between those two sides. And we're able to see existing patterns that we would expect to see, that were part of the rationale for setting the test up in the first place by Dr. Ryan and Dr. Shoemaker. But we're also seeing connections that are part of the research opportunities for the future. So very regularly, we'll see new additions. We've just had a new addition relating to Parkinson's that's been added. And so we also know, because of these refinements, that Progene are also constantly fine-tuning from their end too, which gives a real sense of dynamism to what we're all trying to do with this test. You kind of feel you're doing it as a practitioner, but the people who are the architects of this test are still so excited about it that they're also still developing it.
This particular test I've shared in several episodes prior. I really feel that this test saved my life, because at my sickest, I was very critically ill and had severe hypometabolism, and my physician insisted that we had to do this test for precision medicine. And he needed to know exactly what biotoxin was the issue and to really understand the effects of that. And mold was very much in the conversation, but people were throwing other labels and diagnoses at me. And it was the opportunity to really fine-tune and explain why I had such a severe presentation. And to everyone's surprise, the results showed genetic expression for actinomyces and endotoxins and not mold. That really helped us to be able to tailor my treatment plan and to get me to really where I am today. So it is quite a powerful tool.
It is indeed. And I like to use the quote that Dr. Shoemaker said right from the start about this test, that if you don't know the transcriptomics, or if you don't know the genes, you don't know the illness.
Mm-hmm. It's so true. I'm finding, talking to people that are going through this process, that get a GENIE test, they have the opportunity to meet with their physician. However, there's never enough time to go over all the intricacies of this test. You're meeting with the doctor and you have lots of blood labs and conversations to be had. People leave with some answers, but they also walk away with wanting to be able to just explain a little bit more about what they're seeing in all these bubbles. So when you get a GENIE test back, there are multiple different sections with lots of different bubbles representing genes. You're in an appointment, you think you understand, and then you leave and wait, how do I explain to my husband, what I just heard? Or how can I look at this test and be able to explain to my family members, why I'm so tired or why we're doing this type of treatment? Some things get lost in translation. My hope with this podcast always, and with the work that I'm doing, is just to empower people to feel that they could look at this test and maybe understand what they're seeing a little bit more. Louise agreed to help us to do a very brief surface level sort of whistle stop tour of the different sections on the GENIE test, so that people feel like when they look at this later and they want to learn a little bit more, that they can understand what they're seeing.
Sure. So we can go through it from the top to the bottom, but I thought I'd just take a moment to explain how I look at it. When I'm talking through the GENIE with clients, I don't go through it from top to bottom. What I do is I look at CIRS-specific markers relating to how Dr. Shoemaker defines CIRS on the GENIE. I look through those sections first with somebody to say, are we hitting the marks that we would expect to for a CIRS GENIE? And then I'm going to look through what are those possible triggers then for that CIRS picture. So I'm breaking it down into, is this a CIRS-y kind of GENIE? What are the potential triggers? And then I'm going to be looking at some of the other markers on the test to say, okay, so we've hit the marks with CIRS, we get what the triggers are. So what's the downstream effect of that? What's your body doing because of that? So I break it down into 3 different ways. And then from that, I'm going to pull that together for somebody and just say, okay, we've got all of this information now. Are there any underlying considerations we need to think about? And then what are the therapeutics that are indicated from that? So I have a slightly different way of looking at it.
I would love to hear your approach. I feel like that would be very helpful for people. Let's do it.
I think one of the most important things to do first is just to think about, what does a CIRS GENIE look like? So if you've got your GENIE test in front of you, let's just look at some of those key things that we would need to know, the sorts of things that we would be looking at as CIRS practitioners to say, yeah, this is a CIRS looking GENIE. We would look in section 1, and we would really want to see that the ribo large and small, which are the last 2 markers within that first section, we typically would expect them to be dark blue. So we probably need to back up for a moment and just say, oh no, what does the red and blue look like? What do they mean? Because we've got these 2 different color schemes on the GENIE. So we should probably just talk about that first, shall we?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is a gene expression test. Now, the body's, I've learned this from Dr. Ryan, so I can't claim to be the person that thought about this. Dr. Ryan reminds us that the body's actually quite conservative. It doesn't really want to have to put a lot of energy into things if it doesn't have to. And so typically what we would like to see is white all over this report, because that's like normal function. When we're seeing blue, and the darker the level of blue, we're seeing underperforming or underexpression of gene activity. Now that may be okay, but in some cases it's not. And similarly, when we're seeing the red, this is overexpression or some kind of extra activity. And again, that could be good or it might be bad. So we need to have the skill of understanding what those reds and blues mean. But that's essentially what we're looking at. We're looking at whether something's underperforming or overperforming, but in either direction, that could be good or bad.
Wonderful. And so that ribo large, ribo small, that might be dark blue. What does that show for people?
Sure. So this is really the pivotal marker on the test, really, as far as I'm concerned. It's the first thing I look to. Are we seeing dark blue there? Because if we are, then we can assume that there's been something that has changed the expression of the ribosomes. And the ribosomes form a really important role within cells. They actually comprise about 1/4 of our cells. There's so many of them in each cell. So everybody thinks that the mitochondria are super important, and they are, but we can't forget these other aspects like the ribosomes and peroxisomes as well. So the ribosomes are the way that we actually produce proteins for repair and replication in the body. They really help keep us functioning. So when they get affected by toxins, the gene expression is likely to just slow down a bit and underexpress. So we would expect to see some kind of underperformance in that section. That's what we're really looking at first. Is this really biotoxin illness? And we can really get an idea there as to whether it might be. And then we're looking at some of the other markers in that section, the NDUF, the ATP synth, COX, and M-translocases. So those are all to do with how we are producing and utilizing energy and actually getting that energy into the mitochondria, which are the battery packs of our cells. So if we're not seeing white or red there and we're seeing that green, then we're going to see some underperformance, and we're more likely to see a fatiguing kind of picture for somebody. I look at section 14 in conjunction with this as well, because we've got 2 markers there. So if everybody wants to just flick over to section 14, we can see the CoQ10b and the UQCRQ. They're also part of what we call the electron transport chain, which is part of that mechanism for just creating ATP and energy. Very often, if we're seeing this hypometabolic picture between those 2 sections with those markers, then we're much more likely to see a reduction in energy production in the body and in the cells in particular. And then the other marker within section 1 as well would be the mito large, mito small. So these are the mitoribosomes. And in particular, the mito large, if we're seeing downregulation there, then that may also have an association with MARCoNS. related to the toxins, the polycyclic ether toxins that the Marcons produce. So in that section 1, we're really looking to see that underperforming of energy, perhaps related to Marcons, perhaps related to other biotoxins as well. That's really where we're looking first. We can also look in section 12. So if you just scroll forward to section 12, this is where we have the CD3D. And CD3D relates to your immune system capacity to create antibodies. So let's just think about that for a moment. Why would that be an issue if that was underperforming? So if it was underperforming, it would mean that we're not actually able to create robust levels of antibodies. We know very much that CIRS is a chronic inflammatory response syndrome. So where is that inflammation coming from? And part of where that inflammation is coming from is from, let's break it down even further. We have two sides of our immune system. So inflammation can come from either side. But what we're thinking about in CIRS is what I call the left-hand side of the immune system. This is a flagging and tagging part of the immune system. This immune system is just going to hunt around your system, looking for issues, and then it's going to flag it and say, hey, I've got a problem. I found this thing. It looks like mold shape or something shape, and I think we should create an antibody to it. So I need to pass it over so that the right-hand side of the immune system can create an antibody to it. And then from this moment on, maybe in about 6 weeks, if we ever see this thing again, then we'll be able to do something about it. But these two sides of the immune system have to work really well together. And for those of you that are literate in CIRS and know about HLA, so we HLA type so that we know how well these two sides of the immune system essentially talk to each other. If you can't pass over that information very well from one side or the other, the left-hand side's just going to stay high going, I've found something, I've got a problem. And so this is going to create more of an issue. So when we're thinking about CD3D, this is relating to how well this right-hand side of your immune system can create antibodies. So if it's not getting those messages, it's not going to create the antibodies, or there may be another issue, which means it can't create the antibodies. So we really want to see if that CD3D is or low. That means that we're just not going to be getting the normal expected kind of immune response. So that's the reason why we look at that. And then we look at section 13 and 14. So in this section, especially in section 13, we're expecting to see upregulation. So red for 4 genes for stage 1 CIRS case. So when we don't see that, but the rest of the test is looking CIRSy, it could be that somebody's out of their previous exposure, or there may be something else that's impacting on the results. So we're expecting to see at least 4 there. So we've got a hypometabolism in section 1, some blue. If we've got a blue or at least a negative value for CD3D in section 12, and we've got 4 markers in red in section 13, then we know that we're hitting the marks for a CIRSy kind of case. Section 19 is the dispersion. And for a really valid result that we can just look at and say, yeah, this also fits the picture. If it's under 1, then it's a valid result. So we know that everything's as it should be. That's what we're looking at, to be looking at a result to say, yeah, this is basically a CIRSy kind of case. So then we'd be starting to think about, okay, what are the triggers then? And this is when we get into the more environmental side of things. It's up to you now, Melanie. Do you want to carry on looking at it that way, or should we go top to bottom now?
This is great. I feel like we're covering the highlights, and I love being in your brain, how you would approach it as a practitioner to understand it. I think that's really going to be helpful for people. So carry on.
That's great. I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but if somebody's trying to give me a list and it's just tune out, I'm only human. I try and make it interesting for my clients and try and group things, because I just feel like we can hold attention better. We can get through a few more things. Ultimately, someone's doing this test because they want confirmation of something. So if we're looking at confirmation of, is this a CIRS, then we're going to get that information. This test will also tell us when it isn't. And that's always really interesting, because we may have somebody sitting there going, hang on a minute, everything in section 1 is red. What on earth is going on? You know, that's not classic CIRS if that's the case. That means that there's overexpression there. Somebody's producing too much RNA. Why might that be? Those are things to go back and ask your practitioner, because that may not be classic CIRS. So that's why I start with that first. Are we looking at a CIRSy case? And if we are, great. If not, well, we've got to have a different kind of conversation. And both are equally valid and useful, but that's what's so great about this test. Then we move on to potential triggers. Everybody always wants to know about the endotoxins, the actinomycetes, the mycotoxins, or mold these days. Those are the three things that we're really looking at. We're hoping that there's going to be more information soon about other elements like beta-glucans, for example, but at the moment, we've got fairly good evidence that tracks across several different types of tests to show us that there is good evidence on GENIE for endotoxins, for actinomycetes, and for mycotoxins. Mycotoxins probably don't need too much of an explanation, but endotoxins and actinos might be fairly new terms for people. So I don't know if you just want to explain to everyone what they are. Or...
Sure. Actinomyces is part of the toxic soup that you might encounter in the water damaged building. It's a mix, from what I understand, of bacteria, fungi, and trigger people in their immunoreactivity and end up ultimately colonizing the skin. People can be then immunoreactive to the amount of actinobacteria that's on their skin. You can help me clarify this, because this is an area where I'm a little unclear on that. If it's the actinobacteria from the water damaged building that then colonizes the skin, or is it just that we become reactive to what's already on the skin? Can there be that circumstance as well?
I think when we're thinking about actinos, let's bring it into another aspect of CIRS that people may be more familiar with. So people may be more familiar with the MARCoNS as well. So that's the multiple antibiotic resistant coag-neg staph. So that's the antibiotic resistant bacteria that we can find in our sinuses. So when we're thinking about CIRS, we're thinking about how our system is responding to the outside world, aren't we? Ultimately, that's what we're thinking. And what's going on for us to have inflammation because of that exposure. So we can look to the areas that are interfacing with the outside world for us to help to understand that a little bit better. So obviously the sinuses are a place of interface, and so's the skin. Something that threads both of those things together is one of the biomarkers that we look at in CIRS called MSH. So that's alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. And that's part of our protection. It's part of our hormone protection. And it covers the lining of the body on the outside on our skin, but also inside. So when we have low MSH, it's just going to make us a little bit more vulnerable to the outside world. It's going to mean that something that's quite innocuous, that we should be able to cope with, can then colonize, and then the colony can get bigger and bigger. Different things can happen to that colony, that means that the immune system can no longer cope, and also then the things that we try and do to change that colony or reduce it a bit don't work. That's where the antibiotic resistance comes in, because these colonies can develop biofilm, for example, which is like a sticky complex that the bacteria secrete over themselves, that mean that any antibiotics just come in and ping off and don't get where they need to, which is the other side of the biofilm and into the colony. And when we're thinking about the actinose bacteria on our skin, we should have levels probably of under 10,000 on our skin, but we'll see levels of over 3 million on a skin swab test. It just means that we're just not able to keep these colonies of things that we should be able to coexist with in balance. That's fine for some of these organisms, but for others, like the MARCoNS that can create the biofilm or produce the toxins, the actinos, there are certain strains that have something in their membrane that mean that they're just a bit more of a challenge to us. And so that's why we look at the Corynebacterium tuberculostericum and the Propionibacterium acnes. Why these things have to have such huge names, I don't know, because it can be really difficult for us. So we shorten Propionibacterium to P. acnes, but that's now also got an updated name as well called Cutibacterium. So you've always got to stay on top of these things, which is why it's great to work with practitioners who can firstly say the names, but second, know what to do about them as well. So the actinobacteria, yes, to answer the question, now that we've situated the fact that this is as much to do with our response as it is the organism itself as well, we can find them naturally in our environments. We find them in the soil, but we also find them in human habitat. And when they're in human habitat, they will migrate to moist areas. So they will migrate to bathrooms, to bedrooms, to closets where people are getting changed, where there's moisture happening. And you're right, you've just said they're part of the toxic soup in a water damaged environment. But because they really like moisture, they will also then start to colonize our skin and our moist creases as well, be that an elbow crease behind the ear, wherever. And they also, when they're colonizing our skin, they like to utilize something called extracellular vesicles, which take them from the just under the top layer of skin where they actually like to live down into our bloodstream. And then when they're in the bloodstream, this is where they can become more of an issue because levels also build up in the bloodstream. So when we're thinking about CIRS, we're thinking about also testing on a skin swab test how much we have on our skin. We can also test how much we have in our blood. When we're thinking about the actinos, Dr. Shoemaker and Dr. Ryan very astutely realized that there was a signature pattern for actinos on the GENIE as well. So we can also see if there's gene expression happening because of too many actinos. And so we look particularly at the markers TGF beta receptors in the cytokine section, and then also MAP kinase section as well. We're looking at those two sections when we're thinking about the endotoxins, again, relate to bacteria, but they relate to the membrane shedding of bacteria. And they are particularly associated with sewage and sewer gas when we're thinking about the environment that we live in. So endotoxins have a particular signature on this test as well. And that's when we're thinking about CD14 and TLR4. We really need to think about those sections. And a TLR4 greater than 1.37 on the GENIE is associated with endotoxin exposure.
So that is section 9 and section 10 on your GENIE. And then the TGF-BR is in the cytokine section, which is 5 as of right now.
The Parkinson section was just recently added as section 19, so dispersions become 20. Occasionally they kind of change. That's why I was saying the name of the title of that particular section. What we have to remember of those, of course, when we're thinking about the mold, the actinos, the endotoxins, we really are expecting to see that ribosome downregulation in section 1 first. So that's what we're also really looking at. So we need to see that in concert with these other patterns as well. And then for mycotoxins, we would need the HERTS-Me2, the dust Swiffer test for context for this. And here we may also see MAP kinase upregulation as well, but perhaps not the TGF-beta that we would see with the actinos. And when we're looking for the triggers, that's what we're looking at. We can also look to markers CD81 in currently section 11, because this could associate with other factors as well. This is a B cell response. So it could be that there's a B cell response, which is a historic antibody response, really. This could associate to a historic virus or something that somebody's been exposed to in the past that they may also still be struggling with. And then when we're thinking about triggers, we also have to think about markons, which again is going back to that section 1 with the mito large downregulation as well. Again, we're looking to see have we got a CIRS kind of picture, and then we're looking at those potential triggers as well.
Would the B cells typically show up as blue then downregulated if that wasn't working properly?
We would expect to see them upregulated if there was an issue. If there's downregulation, it means that there's underperforming by B cells. But if there's something red there, then it could mean that there is something historic that somebody's also potentially still dealing with. That's not to say that there isn't anything more acute happening. So we can certainly look to the Lyme section. We can look to the granzymes and defensin section to see if there's anything else going on. But in terms of classic CIRS, that's the kind of picture that we're looking at. So I just thought it was worth looking at that first to say, okay, this is the classic CIRS kind of picture that we're looking at to do with water damaged environment.
Wonderful. Is there anything else in that presentation before I ask some specific questions about some of the other areas?
I think that's really it from looking at a GENIE so that somebody can say, yep, I know this now. I've got a CIRS kind of GENIE.
Wonderful. Can you
damage them.
explain a little bit about the Lyme section, how this Lyme section came to be?
So the Lyme section actually came from some work by researchers called Bouquet and Xu, and I apologize for the pronunciation if that's not completely perfect, in 2016. They were the ones that really illustrated that there could be a transcriptomic signature for Lyme disease, both before antibiotics and afterwards. That's what we are able to understand when we're looking at that.
When we're looking at the Lyme and the granzymes defensin section, which could possibly show some sort of infection, would that be red, upregulated, if that was the case?
Exactly that. So we would expect to see red with the defensins, yes, because they're antimicrobial peptides. So when we say antimicrobial, they're going to be going after some kind of infection, and whether that's bacterial or viral. The defensins kill bacteria, viruses, fungi, etc. Then the granzymes are actually something that's used by different cells to destroy unhealthy cells. So when we get the combination, they're doing very specific, but when we're actually thinking about the defensins, we know that there's something a little bit more current happening that the body's actually trying to deal with. That's when we would be thinking about, is there actually a sinus infection, a urinary tract infection, lung infection, or something? It's pointing to something that somebody may want to get investigated a little bit further.
What you're really hearing so far from what Louise has explained is you're able to show if you have hypometabolism, that chronic fatigue that is very debilitating for folks with biotoxin illness. You're able to see the cytokines that are upregulated, that are reacting to whatever the biotoxin of choice is, whether that's mycotoxins, actinos, endotoxins. We're able to see how our T cells, B cells are responding to the agent in the body, how the immune system is responding. And then also if that could be Lyme related or bacteria related with some sort of infection. You're really getting a lot of information just from those particular sections. And there are other areas on the test. I guess I'm curious about the insulin section, for example. A lot of people will notice as they're going through their recovery that there is difficulties with eating sugar. They have to maybe modify their diet in some way. Is the insulin section somehow related to how we're using the blood sugar in the body? Do we get any information that could align with that sort of symptom presentation?
Yes, we definitely do. It is a complex section. I think the metabolic side of CIRS is a really, really complex area.
Yeah.
So just to keep it super simple for today, I think what we just need to think about is the IRS2, whether we're seeing that red or blue might indicate whether somebody's able to utilize the glucose properly in their cells or not. I think really in CIRS side of things, Dr. Shoemaker has an answer for that, with us thinking about having that low amylose diet.
Yes, key point. Thank you. The apoptosis is a word that most people aren't super familiar with prior to. So my understanding of that is it's the way your body gets rid of cells that have died. Is that accurate? And why is that important or on this test?
Yeah, so it is important because we're talking about programmed cell death. It's the orderly destruction of cells. It's what we would expect. We're not going to hold on to every single cell we've ever had. There's a cycle that needs to happen here. We need to get rid of cells that are perhaps becoming a little bit unhealthy, for example. It's just a normal housekeeping process. Unfortunately, for some people, that becomes defective in the CIRS kind of situation. So this is where we might see a little bit of imbalance here. And one marker in particular to just pull out is the RIPK1. This results in the most dramatic suppression of that process that we were just talking about. I think the data suggests that we might find that in about 15% of cases. That can also then just set off an internally driven inflammatory response that can just be a little bit different than typical CIRS. So that's just something that people might like to be aware of if they have that RAPK1 upregulated on their GENIE.
There's a lot of conversation post-COVID about coagulation and how clotting has been impacted by the virus or the vaccine. And so if there were any challenges with that, would that show up in the 4 section, the coagulation section?
Yeah, this is actually one of the most important sections on GENIE when we're thinking about what is the fallout of CIRS. So this is when I would talk through the insulin section, the apoptosis section, the coagulation section. This is like what is happening to your system because of this CIRS picture. The GENIE, when we're thinking about the coagulation section, we very much look to the work of Sidney Strickland on this. He was one of the first people to talk about something called the vascular hypothesis of neuronal injury. You can tell that's just a term that Dr. Shoemaker was just going to jump on immediately and go, okay, let's look at this and let's look at the GENIE in the context of this as well. So what we've learned to do is look at this section in conjunction with the tubulin section as well, the cytoskeleton section. So that's towards the end of the GENIE. You can flick forward and just have a look at that section now if you want as well. If you've got 3 or more red markers within that section, and you've got upregulation or red in that cytoskeleton section with the tubulins, then you're just a little bit more at risk with your brain health as you're aging. So it's a really important section to be aware of, especially if you've got a family history of stroke or any kind of cognitive decline risk in the family as well. What we really need to be thinking about is reducing that coagulation, reducing the inflammation that's driving the coagulation ultimately. Sidney Strickland's work really was making us aware of the fact that we are more likely to have microclots in our brain if we have a high level of coagulation.
Just want to ask a couple more questions about GENIE and then switch our conversation. What is Icaros?
CIRS is essentially zinc finger protein. We look at that in the conjunction of the VIPR1, which is another really important marker on the GENIE. So we're looking to see if there's a mismatch there, because that might tell us that somebody is just a little bit more likely to have some kind of MCS, multiple chemical sensitivity. But we're also looking, so if one's up and one's down, so really what we're looking at is upregulated or a positive digit in the Icarus section of those 3 markers and a down regulation in the VIPR1 marker. We use VIPR1 to help us understand what the VIP situation might be in the body. And yes, we're all very important people, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about vasoactive intestinal peptide, which is the hallmark of Dr. Shoemaker's protocol, the VIP spray. So if that VIP is down-regulated, what it might actually mean is that you could benefit from the VIP treatment at some point in your CIRS journey.
Wonderful. 2 last parts, the PTSD section. If this section is upregulated for somebody, what could that mean for them?
I think we all have to thank in the CIRS community Dr. Michelle van der Westhuizen for an amazing presentation that she did some time ago now for the group to really help us understand the association with adverse childhood experiences and also HLA genes, the way that our brains develop and the way that our stress response develops really helps encode this gene in particular. There are also many other practitioners of different disciplines who also look at this marker as well. So really, it's just a marker of how our stress response is responding. And we do have over 80 genes actually that are associated with stress, but this particular one, FKBP5, is a marker that is indicative of an upregulated stress response. So it can be associated with PTSD. Now, that's not to say if somebody doesn't have it upregulated that they don't have PTSD. It just means also as practitioners that we might need to take a little bit more care over somebody who has an upregulated, especially if they have a low VEGF on their blood work, because they just might be experience a slightly deeper sense of overwhelm and just may need a little bit of extra support.
And then I dare go into section 16 because Louise is the histamine queen. She just did an absolutely wonderful talk on histamine at CIRS-X, the national conference. If you want to get a deep dive into histamine, I highly recommend that you watch her talk. It's now free up in the CIRS-X video library, so everybody can watch that if they want to dive into their own understanding of histamine expression. But what can you just say a couple sentences about this section?
Oh, you don't go on too long. And I could. I love this. Well, I love histamine because it's the thing that had affected me the most, and I didn't understand it. And you did ask me a pre-question before we sat down today, and I looked at it because you said, can you tell me a story about a genie that's changed somebody's life? And I've got to tell you, Genie changed my life.
Mm.
It was because of that section. I always have known, ever since being a young child, that I had a problem with my immune system, but I didn't have classic allergy. So I have an issue with that left-hand side flagging and tagging part of my immune system. Mine is a little bit skewer. It goes its kind of own way. And so that has led to a really strange kind of ongoing immune response that I could never get properly diagnosed. So I'd always felt my doctors get it, but maybe not completely. And so when I actually saw my markers positive on the GENIE test, it was like validation. And I say that with the greatest of humility because I know exactly what it feels like for our clients when they get this test, and it's validation for what they've been feeling. CIRS is a very invisible illness. And for those that are fortunate, because not everyone can afford to, but for those that are fortunate enough to be able to get these kinds of tests and have that validation, can be one of the most empowering things, especially if they've been chronically ill for a long time and have perhaps been led to believe that this is all in their head, or actually it's all to do with a different kind of diagnosis like fibromyalgia, for example. Mm-hmm. And they've never really completely understood what this is. To get this test and for them to be able to see a signature pattern, for them to understand this is real and that there is somebody that can actually not only understand it, but guide them through a therapeutic journey. It's enormously empowering. And I had that moment myself when I looked at my test result and I saw that I actually had upregulations in that histamine section. It was so validating, and it led me to go back to my doctors and advocate for myself more than I would have done previously, because I'd been fobbed off a little bit. I kind of had a diagnosis, but it didn't really make sense to me. And so I went back and really asked for more support, and I got it, which was just so empowering. So we can use this test in many, many different ways, but I would always encourage my clients to go back into the regular healthcare system if there is something on this test that they actually do need more conventional support with. And I think that's a super important thing. Dr. Shoemaker has taught us all to always be aware of the differential diagnosis, and this is just one of those areas. When we're thinking about this section, what we can be thinking about is that CCL5 is a marker that kind of tells us that there is a histamine issue going on, but this could be as a result of something else in the body. It could be to do with your oral health, it could be your periodontal health, but that's certainly something to really start to look at and think about. Then the histamine decarboxylase, that's actually telling us a bit more of a conventional picture about histamine. Is your histamine tap basically being turned on genetically? And are you just going to be more at risk of having a histamine response? And we're not talking about histamine in the gut here. We're talking about histamine in our cells. Let's not forget. There's different ways that we process that histamine, if it's in our cells or if it's in our gut. And it just means that there's slightly more complex picture that we need to think about. Neither of those markers are mast cell activation. So with this test, and this is one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it, is because it's actually saying to us, no, actually, this isn't just mast cell activation, or in fact, it may not be. This is actually really to do with the histamine gene expression. It's just helping us get even more information about those really complex clients who are having all sorts of strange hypersensitivity type reactions.
Yeah. Beautifully said. Thank you. I know you're holding back. That was great. Wonderful. This has been fantastic. I'm so appreciative of you walking us through the GENIE in that way. I think it gives it more context and can help people feel a little bit more confident to go back and look at what they're seeing. Would love to close it out with another question about you and the CIRS community. What would be your deepest wish or wishes for the CIRS community right now?
Oh my goodness. I mean, you know, because we're both so fortunate to be part of it. This community is the most incredible group. It's humbling and at the same time exciting and empowering to be part of it. I just hope that this practitioner community continues to grow, and that the data and research continues to develop, and that we can better serve our clients. And I refer to Eric Dorninger, his mantra that he always says that we are just hoping to graduate the chronically ill out of CIRS. And for those in the CIRS community who are struggling as patients, just know that everybody who works as a practitioner in this field, who's part of Dr. Shoemaker's group, are just doing all that we can to help you. So just keep communicating with your practitioner and with the CIRS community generally. There's so many different ways that you can interact. So many of the practitioners in this group have different things that you can tap into. So just reach out, don't feel isolated. As Melanie said at the start, this is all about empowerment. So just feel empowered with every step that you're taking on your journey, because you're not alone.
Thank you, Louise. I hope that everybody listening can really take to heart Louise's story, having exposures as a kid, being genetically susceptible and having different immune issues, but overcoming that. And now paying it forward, creating all of these solutions to the problems that we have so people can get answers. You are really an inspiration. And as a woman just stepping into the surviving mold community, it is fantastic to have people like you, leaders to look up to, and really you're a collaborator. You're always acknowledging others and bringing people in. So thank you for being that type of role model for everybody.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for listening and for your kind attention. To keep in touch, follow the Heart of CIRS podcast on Instagram. You can visit melaniepensack.com/the Heart of CIRS to donate. Your generosity helps to keep this podcast growing. May the awareness of CIRS spread far and wide, helping to change millions of lives for the better.